The coffee was still dripping when he walked out. He hadn't slept much. The rain had come in the night, the way it always did in late July. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like something that had been held back too long and finally stopped trying. He'd lain in bed listening to it hammer the tin roof, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, he'd stopped listening and started counting. The sound had lasted nearly 6 hours. He knew what that meant for the low fields. He pulled on his boots at the back door without sitting down. His knees protested the way they always did in the morning, stiff and slow to trust him, but he moved through it the way he moved through most things, without complaint, without hurry, just steadily forward until the body remembered what it was supposed to do. The yard was soaked. Puddles had joined together into something larger than puddles. Water ran in thin silver sheets off the barn roof and pattered into the mud below. The sky was the color of old pewter, soft and low, and still draining whatever was left in it, though the worst had passed. There was no wind. The whole world seemed quieter than usual, the way it goes after a violence, that strange, almost respectful silence that follows something large. He walked to the edge of the field. The southwest corner was the piece that had broken his patience for 3 summers running. 4 acres of ground with the bad habit of swallowing water and refusing to give it back, shaped by the land's own slow lean, into a kind of bowl that no amount of cursing had ever fixed. He'd planted beans there again this year, same as always, because a man doesn't stop planting just because a piece of land has been difficult. He plants and watches, and tries to understand what the land is trying to tell him before it runs out of patience with him entirely. He stood at the edge and looked. The rows were standing, green, upright. The plants still beaded with last night's rain, but rooted and whole and exactly where he'd left them. The water had come through, he could see that. The field had taken on water, moved it, handled it, but the rows themselves had not drowned, not this time. He looked out past his fence line. The neighbor's low field to the south was a flat mirror of sky and standing water. The old Halverson ground further up the road was the same, though he could only see the edge of it from here. Somewhere, a crow called once and went quiet. He stood there for a long moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, not speaking, not smiling, just looking at the green rows the way a man looks at something he was not entirely sure would work until it did. Then he turned and went back inside to pour his coffee. The field wasn't going anywhere. Neither was the morning. 3 summers before that morning, the field had been the same story told twice already. The first time, he'd written it off as weather. The second time, he'd told himself the same thing, because a man needs somewhere to put his disappointment, and weather is a patient container. The third time, standing at the edge of the southwest corner with water up over his boot soles and 4 acres of bean rows laid flat in the mud, like something the land had simply decided to take back, he stopped telling himself anything at all. He crouched down. That was the difference. Other men might have stood there with their hands on their hips and looked up at the sky, at the retreating clouds, at whatever passed for blame in the middle distance. He crouched down and put his hand flat against the soil, the way you press a palm to a table to feel if it's level. He wasn't grieving. He was measuring. The water had already begun to move, which told him something. Standing water sits still. Moving water is going somewhere, which means the land has an opinion about where it wants the water to go, and the only question worth asking is whether that opinion can be used. He felt the slight pull of it against his fingers, a slow, cold current threading through the mud toward the southwest, the field's low corner, the direction the whole parcel tilted, barely noticeable when it was dry, undeniable when it was wet. He pressed his hand harder into the soil and spread his fingers wider. 4 inches of slope across 300 feet of ground, maybe a little more. He'd walked this field 50 times, but he'd walked it thinking about rows, about spacing, about planting depth. He hadn't walked it thinking about where the water wanted to go. That was the mistake, not his alone. It was the kind of mistake that comes from looking at land as something that grows crops, rather than something that moves water first and grows crops second, if you ask it correctly. He stayed crouched there longer than his knees wanted him to. A man with bad knees who stays crouched in cold mud is a man who is thinking hard enough that the body's complaints stop registering. He was tracing it in his mind, the slope, the row direction, the way each furrow had become a small river running the wrong way, carrying soil instead of channeling water. The field wasn't broken, the drainage was. The water had nowhere useful to go, so it stayed and drowned everything it touched. He stood up slowly, one hand on his knee. The creek at the field's far edge was no more than 40 yards from the worst of the damage. 40 yards. The water wanted to get there. It had been trying to get there every summer. It just needed something to follow, something buried along the slope lines, something that could carry it without collapsing, without filling with silt after the first rain. He started walking the slope line from memory, his boots printing dark shapes in the flattened mud. He kept walking the slope for another hour that evening, then again the next morning before the light was fully up. He walked it the way a man rehearses something, not because he has forgotten the steps, but because he needs to feel certain in his body, not just in his head. The creek was there. The slope was consistent. The math of it was simple enough that the simplicity itself made him pause, wondering why 3 summers of loss hadn't made it obvious sooner. Sometimes grief slows a man's thinking. Sometimes stubbornness does the same work from the other direction. He'd been fighting the water. That was the mistake. Every correction he'd tried, the raised rows, the replanting, the reworking of the soil, had been an argument made against the rain. And the rain had won every time, patiently and without malice, because water doesn't argue back. It just finds the lowest point and goes there. He needed to give it a road. The question was what kind. Tile would cost more than he had. Perforated pipe was possible but would silt up fast in clay soil like his. He thought about it for most of a week, and the answer came the way most useful things came to him. Not as a sudden idea, but as a slow recognition of something he'd already seen. The auction was on a Thursday, held at a property 2 miles east of town, where an old sporting outfitter had closed up and left things behind. The auctioneer was a broad man with a canvas hat and a voice that carried clean across a gravel lot. Most of the crowd was there for the outboard motors and the fishing tackle. Nobody paid much attention to the 6 aluminum canoes stacked along the fence line, dented and sun-faded and spotted with old watermarks. Priced so low they'd apparently embarrassed even the auctioneer into going fast. He raised his hand before the bidding found a second voice. He bought all 6. The crowd didn't react much at first. It was only when he pulled his pickup around and started loading them alone, lifting each one by its bow, sliding it into the truck bed with the slow efficiency of a man who plans his movements before he makes them, that people started to look. 6 aluminum canoes in a rusted pickup. No trailer, no boat rack, just canoes hanging off the tailgate and sticking out over the cab with an old rope holding them down. The feed store clerk was there with a friend, and he watched the loading with a tilted head before saying something that made his friend laugh. It wasn't said quietly enough. A few others turned to look. The old man finished tying the rope, tested the knot once with both hands, walked around to the driver's side and got in. He didn't look back at the crowd. He put the truck in gear and pulled out of the lot slow, the canoes rattling softly overhead, and he already had the field in his mind. The morning after the storm, he made his coffee the same way he always did. He filled the percolator from the tap, measured the grounds without looking at the can, set it on the burner, and stood at the counter while it worked. There was no ceremony to it. It was just what a man did when he woke up, and the day was waiting. The kitchen was quiet, in the particular way that kitchens get quiet after heavy rain. A settled, wrung-out stillness, like the house itself had held its breath through the night and was only now letting go. He carried the cup to the table and sat down. Her seed tin was on the windowsill where it always was. The red paint on the lid faded to something closer to rust, the small dent on one side that had been there as long as he could remember. He didn't look at it the way a man looks at something he's studying. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that simply belongs in the room, the way a clock on the wall belongs, or a worn spot on a floorboard. It was there. That was enough. Outside, the sky had gone pale and scrubbed clean, the kind of blue that only comes after a storm spends everything it has. The yard was wet. The gravel drive had a thin sheet of water still running along its low edge, finding the ditch in no hurry. The old oak at the field's corner had shed 2 small branches in the night, and they lay where they'd fallen, dark and wet against the grass. He drank his coffee and didn't turn on the radio. He heard the truck before he saw it, the low idle of a diesel engine coming along the county road, slowing where it shouldn't slow. Not stopping, not pulling in, just slowing. He knew the sound of that engine, the way you know the sounds of things that have been close to your life for years. The neighboring farmer. He would be coming from his own fields, or what was left of them. He would have already walked those rows this morning, already seen what the night had done. The truck idled at the road for a long moment. The veteran took another sip of coffee. He did not push his chair back. He did not lean toward the window. He sat with both hands around the cup and let the man at the road have whatever time he needed. He could see, at the far edge of his vision through the kitchen glass, the thin line of the southwest corner field, just a strip of green from this angle, unremarkable unless you knew what it had come through, unless you knew what the fields on either side of that road looked like this morning. Then it was not unremarkable at all. The truck kept idling. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, folded his hands on the table and waited, because waiting was something he had always known how to do. The truck kept idling at the road. In the kitchen, the veteran sat with his empty cup and his folded hands, and somewhere behind that stillness, behind the particular quality of patience that had shaped itself into him over decades, there was a different morning altogether. There were evenings, rather. Several of them, strung across the first week of May like a series of small, quiet arguments with the earth. He had started with a hand level, old thing, wooden-handled, the bubbles slightly slow to settle the way old tools get when they have been used long enough to develop something like a pinion. He would set it on the ground, wait for the bubble, mark the reading on a strip of paper he kept folded in his jacket pocket, then move the stake. A man watching from the road would have seen nothing dramatic, just an old farmer walking slow across a wet field in the early evening, stopping every few feet, crouching with some difficulty, rising again. Bad knees made the crouching a deliberate decision each time. Not painful exactly, not in a way that stopped him, but present, always present, the way old damage tends to be, reminding without punishing. He had sketched the slope on paper. Nothing formal, a hand drawing, really, the kind of thing a man makes when he is thinking out loud in pencil. He had done it at the kitchen table 3 nights in a row, adjusting it each evening after another hour in the field. The land sloped from northeast to southwest across those 4 acres, not steeply, barely perceptibly to the eye, but enough. Enough that every time the sky opened in summer, everything ran that direction. Everything collected in the lower third of the rows. Everything sat there until the beans gave up. The math was not complicated. He was not a complicated man with numbers. He wanted the water to move. Not stop, not dam, not pool. Just move. Move laterally, away from the planted rows, toward the low creek that ran along the field's western edge. That was all. He needed channels that matched the slope closely enough that the water would follow them willingly, the way water always follows the path that requires least resistance, if you give it one that makes sense. 6 canoes, laid end to end in 2 long runs, would do it. He had paced the distances. He had checked his sketch against the stake marks in the field. He had revised the paper twice, sitting in the lamplight after supper with his glasses on and the radio going low. An old seed tin on the windowsill caught the light. He had not moved it in years. The evenings cost him more than time. His knees were stiff through each of them, stiff through the nights that followed, stiff in the mornings when he rose before light and walked carefully down the porch steps. He did not consider this a complaint. He considered it the price of attention, and attention was something he had never been willing to shortchange. He started with the spade. Not the tractor, not first. The tractor came later, after he had walked the 2 slope lines again in the early morning and driven thin stakes into the ground at intervals, confirming what his sketch said, confirming what his feet had already learned over 3 bad summers. The slope was subtle. A man in a hurry would have missed it entirely, would have looked at that corner and seen flat ground the way most people see flat ground, as something neutral, something that simply sits there. But water doesn't care what a man sees. Water finds the truth of a surface in the first 30 seconds of a hard rain, and that southwest corner told its truth every July, reliably, without apology. He had watched it tell that truth 3 years running. He was not going to argue with it a 4th time. The spade work took most of the first day. He cut the lines shallow and angled, following the stakes, feeling the resistance of the soil change as he moved, softer near the low end, where old moisture still sat in the subsoil, harder near the upper run, where the clay had baked through the dry weeks before. His knees registered every hour of it. He did not stop for more than water and 1 short rest in the shade of the fence post at midday, sitting on an upturned bucket with his hat off and his face turned toward whatever small wind moved through the field. The tractor blade on the second morning widened and deepened what the spade had started. He ran it slow, correcting the angle twice, where the line drifted slightly off his stakes, backing up and making the pass again without frustration. Slow work done carefully was still faster than fast work done wrong. He had learned that, in places he did not speak about, and had not forgotten it since. The canoes went in on the 3rd day. He lowered each one with a come-along rigged to a fence post, working one end at a time, fitting the bow of each into the stern of the last, so the joints overlapped and nothing gaped. 6 canoes, 2 runs, each run angling away from the bean rows toward the creek at the field's western edge. When the last one was seated in the earth, he stood over it for a moment, not with ceremony, just looking, checking the angle by eye, the way he always checked things by eye when there was no better instrument available. He was packing the soil back over the 3rd canoe of the east run when the neighboring farmer appeared at the fence. The man had been watching for a while before he said anything, long enough that the veteran knew he had been there, had simply continued working. When the comment came, it came with a laugh behind it. "Man burying his vacation out there," the neighbor said. The veteran did not look up from the soil. He packed the earth evenly over the aluminum and moved on to the next. He finished the east run before noon and started on the west before the light failed. The neighbor had gone back to his own work by then, and the field was quiet again, except for the soil and the aluminum and the sound of the come-along clicking 1 ratchet at a time. That was the past. This is the present, and the present is quieter still. The veteran is on the porch when the auctioneer's car slows on the county road. He hears the engine before he sees the car, an old habit, hearing things before they arrive, and he sets his coffee mug on the rail without hurrying. The car does not turn into the drive. It pulls onto the gravel shoulder at the field's edge and stops, and the engine goes off, and for a moment, nothing else happens. Then the door opens and the auctioneer gets out. He is a big man, loud by profession, someone who fills a room with his voice and earns his living by keeping the air moving. He is not loud now. He stands with both hands on his hips and looks at the southwest corner of the field, the way a man looks at something he has to recalculate. The beans are dense and dark green in the morning light, standing in rows that are still clean, still upright, still holding their shape after everything the sky put down in late July. The veteran watches him from the porch. He does not call out. He does not lift a hand. The auctioneer does not knock on the door. He does not walk up the drive. He stays at the field edge, turning his head slowly from one end of the rows to the other, and his hands stay on his hips the whole time, as though he needs something to hold on to. The veteran picks up his coffee mug and takes a slow drink. He remembers the gathering at the farm supply where the auctioneer told a room full of men about the canoes. He had not been there to hear it, but word travels in small towns the way water travels through low ground. It finds its level eventually, and it always does. Someone had repeated the line to him at the feed store. He had nodded and bought his seed and driven home. There was nothing else useful to do with it. Now the auctioneer stands at the edge of what the joke became. The silence between them stretches out over the field. The morning is cool after so many wet days, and the light is thin and even, the kind of light that shows everything plainly without flattering anything. The beans do not need flattering. They are simply there, undamaged, in a county where undamaged beans have become a rare thing. The auctioneer does not move for a long time. The veteran watches him, patient the way he has always been patient, the mug warm in both hands, the seed tin just visible through the window glass behind him. The auctioneer finally nods, once, slowly, and the veteran watches him turn and walk back toward the lane. That nod contains more than the man probably intended to give. It sits in the air after he's gone, the way a word does when it's been said too late but still needed saying. The veteran looks down at his coffee, cold now. He sets the mug on the porch rail and lets his mind walk backward, the way it sometimes does in the quiet after company leaves. Spring came late that year. The ground was still heavy from the long melt, the southwest corner darker than the rest of the field, holding water the way it always held water. He had waited, not because he doubted the canoes. By then they were already in the ground, the shallow trenches packed tight, the drainage lines running toward the creek the way he had planned them all winter on paper. But because you do not plant into cold mud and expect anything good to follow. He had learned that young, before the service, and the service had only confirmed it. Patience is not the absence of urgency. It is knowing which urgencies are real. When the soil temperature finally held where it needed to hold, he planted by hand. Row by row, moving slowly on his bad knees, pressing the seeds into the earth above the buried aluminum, working the corner field the same careful way he worked every other part of the farm. No different in manner, if not in method. The work took 3 days. He did not hurry it. There was no one to perform urgency for. Word got back to the feed store, the way word always did. Someone had seen him out in the corner field again, planting on top of wherever those canoes were supposed to be, and the clerk had apparently made the observation, to whoever happened to be standing at the counter buying mineral blocks or fence staples or a bag of pelleted lime, that the old man had finally lost the plot entirely. The clerk had not said it unkindly, probably. That was almost worse. It was the tone of mild concern a person uses for someone they've already written off. A tone that does not expect to be corrected. The bank officer used a version of the same tone when the veteran came in, about the operating loan. A modest amount, the kind of number that should not have required much discussion. The officer had the file open on his desk, and somewhere in the small talk before the paperwork, he smiled in a way that was not quite unkind and said he'd heard about the canoes. He said it the way you mention something harmless and slightly eccentric about a neighbor. The veteran had looked at him evenly and said the field was planted and the drainage was in, and he expected a reasonable yield come August. The officer had nodded and processed the loan without further comment, but the smile stayed in the room the whole time, quiet as smoke. The storm did not announce itself the way summer storms sometimes do, building all afternoon into a wall of purple and green that gives a farmer time to think. This one came in from the southwest in under an hour, the sky going the color of old iron, the air dropping 10 degrees in the time it took to walk from the machine shed to the porch. He had been watching the clouds since mid-morning, not anxiously, the way a man watches something he has already made a decision about. He sat in the ladder-back chair he kept on the covered porch and listened to it come. The rain started as it meant to go on, not gradually, not building through lighter stages into something heavier, but arriving at full weight almost immediately, the way water falls when the sky has been holding it too long. It hit the tin roof of the porch overhang in a sound like continuous static, like the white noise between radio stations, and within minutes, the dirt lane at the end of the drive had become a shallow river moving south. He did not go out. There was nothing useful he could do in it, and he already knew what the slope would do with 4 inches in 6 hours. He had spent 2 winters thinking about that slope. He had walked it in February mud, and in the dry, cracked heat of August, and in the shoulder seasons when the water table sat high enough to show itself at the surface in dark patches. He knew where the water wanted to go. He had not tried to stop it. He had only tried to give it a better way to get there. The porch railing dripped steadily. Somewhere across the county road he could hear water moving, where water should not have been moving. A low, rushing sound that meant field rows were already running. He thought about his neighbors without satisfaction. He thought about the southwest corner without anxiety. The canoes were in the ground. The furrows ran true to the creek. Either it would work or it wouldn't, and sitting in the dark watching rain was not going to change the arithmetic of it either way. His wife's seed tin was visible through the screen door, on the windowsill in the kitchen, the same place it had been for years. He had moved it once, by accident, and put it back the same afternoon, without quite deciding to. He sat with his hands on his knees and let the storm be as loud as it needed to be. It rained for most of 6 hours. When it finally let up, sometime past 9, he did not take a flashlight out to the field. There was nothing to see in the dark that the morning wouldn't show more clearly. He went inside, washed his hands, and went to bed. Morning came in quiet after a storm always does. The kind of quiet that feels earned, the air still, the light pale and thin, the mud holding the shape of everything that had moved through it. He pulled on his boots at the door and went out before the coffee was done. The southwest corner was intact. He stood at the field's edge for a long time without moving. The bean rows held their lines. The furrows were clean, the runoff gone where the slope had meant it to go, out through the buried canoe channels, down to the creek, away from the roots. A little pooling at the northern edge where the grade flattened, but nothing that would cost him. He crouched down, pressed 2 fingers into the soil between rows, felt moisture but not drowning. He stood again and looked across the rest of his property, then past it, to the low ground that belonged to his neighbor. That field was not standing. He did not linger on it. He went back inside, poured his coffee, and listened to the county road begin to fill with slow-moving pickups, men driving out to look at what the night had done. The neighbor did not come that morning. He came 2 days later, mid-afternoon, when the mud had started to firm enough to walk without losing a boot at every step. The veteran heard the truck before he saw it. That particular engine, slightly rough on the left cylinder, unmistakable if you'd lived beside it for years. He was in the machine shed sharpening a blade when it pulled up the drive. He came out and waited. The man got out slowly. He was not a small man, and he had never carried himself like one, but he crossed the yard differently than he usually did. He stopped a few feet short and looked past the veteran toward the southwest corner, which was still green, in a way that the surrounding fields were not. He said he'd lost most of the low end, said it flat, without elaboration. The veteran nodded. There was a pause. The neighbor looked at his own boots, then back up. He asked, and it cost him something to ask, that much was plain, how that corner had come through. The veteran didn't answer immediately. He set down the sharpening stone, wiped his hands on his jeans, and started walking toward the field. The neighbor fell in beside him without being invited, which was the right thing to do. At the edge of the southwest corner, The veteran stopped and pointed along the slight depression where the first canoe ran beneath the soil. Invisible now, just a subtle line in the earth. He said the field had a slope, said it had always had a slope, said the water was going to move whether you planned for it or not, and the only question was where you aimed it. The neighbors stayed for close to an hour. They walked the full length of each trench line, the veteran pointing where the grade shifted, where the water had moved during the storm, where it had exited clean into the creek without pooling. The neighbor said very little. He was a man who had farmed that county his whole life, who knew its soil and its seasons, and the fact that he'd missed something this plain in a field, 4 acres wide, and sitting right beside his own fence line, seemed to settle into him slowly, the way cold does. He left without making it into anything larger than it was. The veteran watched the truck pull back down the road, then returned to his sharpening stone. 2 days later, the feed store clerk came. He did not come the way a man comes when he's comfortable. He came in his personal truck rather than stopping on his way through, which meant he'd made a decision to come, which meant it had taken him something. He stood at the edge of the drive and said he'd heard the southwest corner had held. The veteran said it had. The clerk looked out toward the field and asked if he could take a look. The veteran said he could. They walked to where the storm's runoff had pulled the soil back slightly near the creek, exposing a short band of aluminum along the edge of the lowest canoe, dull, sun-faded, still holding its shape under the earth. The clerk crouched down and looked at it without speaking. The veteran pointed to the exit point where the water had left the field during the storm, a shallow cut in the bank, clean and deliberate, leading straight into the creek. He explained the angle. He explained how each trench had been dug along the natural grade, rather than across it, so the water moved the direction it already wanted to move, only faster, and toward somewhere it could go without damage. The clerk listened. He did not say anything about the things he had said to other customers in the store. The bank officer came on the 4th day. He was the most formal of them, arriving in a collared shirt, with a folder tucked under one arm, as though the visit had professional purpose. But he left the folder in his car. He walked the same path as the others, exit point, trench angle, the faint outline of aluminum where the earth had worn thin. He asked how deep the canoes were buried. The veteran told him. He asked how long they would hold. The veteran said he didn't know, but long enough to matter. None of them said the word sorry. The veteran did not say the word told. What passed between them was simpler than either of those things and, for that reason, held more weight. He pulled the last of the beans on a Tuesday morning, before the dew had fully lifted off the field. His knees were worse than usual. The cold nights following the storm had settled into the joints the way cold always did. But he moved through the rows at his own pace, which had never been anyone else's pace, and never needed to be. The southwest corner came out clean. The plants had drawn everything they needed from the soil and given it back in kind, the way a field does when it has not been fighting for its own survival all summer. He worked without hurry. The crates filled steadily, and he loaded them into the bed of the truck the same way he had loaded everything else across the years. Carefully, without wasted motion, with the full attention of a man who has learned that care is not slowness, it is accuracy. He did not count the yield aloud. He did not need to. When he carried the last small crate to the house, he set it on the windowsill beside the seed tin. Not because the windowsill was a practical place for it, because it was the right place. The tin had sat there through all 3 bad summers, through the years before the canoes, through the long patience of a man working a field that had not yet agreed to cooperate. He set the crate beside it without ceremony, without a word spoken to the empty kitchen, and then stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the southwest corner through the glass. The field was quiet. The county road beyond the fence line was quiet. The sky above the far tree line held the particular pale blue of a late summer morning that has decided to be peaceful, with no interest in the argument the weeks before it had been having. He made coffee. He drank it standing at the window. the way he had drunk it on every ordinary morning of his life that had turned out, eventually, to be something more than ordinary. The men who had come to the field already knew what they needed to know. He had walked them through it, without ceremony and without scorekeeping, and they had carried it home the same way. Whether they understood it fully was their own work to do, not his. He had done what the land asked of him. He had watched it carefully, learned the direction it wanted to move, and helped it move that way, instead of pouring all his effort into making it move differently. That was the whole of it. There was no other secret. The land was never the problem. It had never been broken. It had only been asking for something no one had thought to give it. Not money, not machinery, not pride. Just a man patient enough to listen.